knitters. I'm Donna Dracunis, and this is class number 2 in our Icelandic yoke sweater workshop, aka chicken sweater. So welcome. Today we are going to do a few things. I'm going to do a short slideshow to go over stuff about just the body of the sweater. We mentioned most of it briefly last class, but I want to go over it again in a little more detail and then see if you have any questions. And I'm going to show you my favorite cast on for sweaters with a couple tips on how to get it to be loose and stretchy. So, okay, does anyone have any questions about their swatching before we get started with the body section of the class?
No.
No?
No, not me.
Okay.
No, I
Something
don't.
comes up, you know where to find me. And I have the chat up too, so you can also type questions in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and we'll go over. We'll go over this slideshow. So can everybody see this now?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to talk about knitting the body today, which is the big number 1. And as I said last time, I split the class into 4 parts so we can have time to, well, actually 5, but the first part was prep. So we can have time to knit in each section. So first, number 1 is the body. Next class will be the sleeves. Third class from now will be the upper yoke and the shoulders and everything. And then the last one will be finishing, which is minimal, but we'll be talking about the necks too. And you may decide to do different, some of you may decide to do different kind of necks. And so that's got its own class. So this shows a pullover, but we will be talking about cardigans. I know at least one person for sure wants to do a cardigan. So we'll be talking about cardigans in each section. The sleeves are the only thing that's exactly the same for pullover and cardigan. So we'll talk about cardigans in all the other classes. So the main thing that we talked about for the body is, do we want to do any shaping in it? In a traditional Icelandic sweater, which actually isn't that old, I'm going to show you some information about it a little bit later, but it's not as old of a knitting tradition as some of the other kinds of sweaters. But in the traditional style, the body's just straight up and down. But we talked about doing waist shaping if we wanted to. And so this is a quick little sketch of what waist shaping looks like. The little dashes on the sides are where you would be working decreases and increases. So we're going from the bottom up. And you would put markers at your side seams, and then you would decrease before and after the side seam markers for a while before you get to your waist, the narrowest part of your body, and then you would increase before and after the side seam markers above the waist as you go up to the bust and before you start the yoke. So I have what I just said in there, and written out a decrease round and increase round, how I would work them, so that you can have this. You don't have to write it down. I will email you this PDF of this after the class, so you don't have to write this down. But it basically just shows where I would work knit 2 together and SSK at the side seams to make it balanced or make it a little bit decorative, rather than just, if you do all knit 2 togethers everywhere, it looks a little bit weird. And so I wrote out how I do that, and then I wrote down where the increase round, I wrote where you can do make one right and make one left to do the same thing. You can even switch the positions of those, and like I wrote make one right before the marker, make one left after the marker. You could switch those if you like how it looks better. To be quite honest, I am like really super lazy about make ones, and I do mine all the same way. Or sometimes I do a lifted bar increase, not the bar, lifted, a lifted increase where I go into the stitch on the row below in the back and knit it. So you can do whatever kind of increases you want there. The make one right and make one left is I put that down because it's typically what you will find in patterns these days. It's fairly invisible, but by doing the right and left, it balances it so that it looks symmetrical at the side seam. So, well, we're knitting in the round. So how do we have side seams? Well, we're just going to put markers in. Basically, I'm going to say you have 200 stitches because that's really easy to calculate with, right? So when you cast on 100, place a marker. That's your side seam. Cast on the second 100, place the marker for the end of the round. That's your other side seam. That's all it is. If you are making a cardigan, it'll be a little different because the end of the round will be the center front.
Mhm.
So if you're making a cardigan, you'll cast on a quarter, put a marker, then cast on the 100 for the back. So it would be cast on 50, put a marker for the first front, cast on 100 for the back, put the second side seam marker, cast on 50. And then from there, you could either knit in the round with that being your end of round, or you could knit back and forth on the body. The other way that we talked about kind of was doing waist shaping just at the front. That sort of is like a bust dart instead of waist shaping. The thing about this that makes it more like a bust dart is you can do this just on the front. When you do your decreases right at the side seams, you have to do it before and after each marker. You have to do it at the front and the back so that the pieces lay flat and you don't get bunching up at the side seams where you don't need any extra bunching up. But if you do your decreases away from the side seams, like towards the where your bust darts would be, then you can do them just on the front. It makes the front have a little bit of 3D shaping, and you don't have to match them on the back if you wanted to make the back without shaping. So basically, you would do something like this, where on the front, you would divide your front into 4 quarters. 2 of the quarters would be in the middle and 1 quarter on each side, and you put markers there. And just like when you did the decreasing at the side seams, you would do the decreasing at the markers only on the outside of the markers. So the stitches in the center front, that stays the same number of stitches all the time, but you're just decreasing and then increasing outside those markers. So in this case, it would be 25, 50, 25 on the front of this sweater, because we had 200 for the total amount, which means 100 for the front, 100 for the back. So we just divide it up like that. If it was a cardigan here, you would just draw a line right down the center and you'd have 1 quarter, 1 quarter, 1 quarter, 1 quarter. And that very center part, if you're knitting back and forth, obviously it's not joined, or that would be your end of the round, but that's how you'd place them. Essentially the same thing, except we have the opening. I think most people would probably knit this kind of sweater in the round because the yoke is going to have color work. And if you're doing any color work at the waist, you wouldn't be wanting to go back and forth with the color work and have those purl rows. So I'm thinking that we'll be mostly have the cardigan people also knitting in the round, and we will cut this open later. So we'll talk about how many stitches you need for the cardigan. That's a little different than the pullover a little later. But does this make sense to you guys? I've written this out again for you, an overview and, you know, step by step how I would place the different kinds of decreases and increases if I was doing this. And then you can do this kind of shaping on the back too, except I would probably split it into thirds rather than quarter, half, quarter. I would probably just split the back evenly into thirds. So if you wanted to bring the waist in, you know, in the back and the front, you can do that. But typically, if we're doing this kind of shaping, it's only done on the front and is considered a bust dart. Now, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute so I can show you my body a little. Okay, where am I screen sharing? Stop sharing. Okay, so I'm going to stand up, let you look at my body instead of my head. So why am I recommending these kind of darts? That they will go right here. You'd have some like pinched like that. That's kind of what it would do. Okay. Why am I recommending that instead of these kind of darts that you might see in a lot of patterns where you add short rows here? Well, two reasons. One is these darts here, we're just decreasing. So it's actually pulling the fabric in and making it get smaller. And it's not adding any length. When you do darts, the short row darts, you're actually adding length to part of the sweater. The other thing is that those come to a certain point. I mean, they come to an exact point from the side. These just pinch it in and then it goes back out, and it's not extreme, but if you have the ones on the side and they point right to the largest part of your bust, if you get a different bra, it might not fit the same way anymore because it moves higher and lower and those kind of things. So I find that the vertical darts, first off, they don't add any length, which we don't really, most of us don't need extra length. If you have really large bust and you wear a bra that makes them stand out more, you might need a little bit of length in the front for that. So something to think about. I have pretty big boobs, to be honest. I wear like whatever it is, like F cup, and some of mine are more pushing up than out than others. And I never add length to the front. For me, it hasn't been necessary. So that might give you an idea. And if you've never made a sweater where you felt like the front was riding up, you know, was too short, then you don't have to worry about that. If you do want to do, anyone wants to do those side bust darts, we can do them. I can help you find a resource for them, but they're not something I've ever done on my own sweaters. And I think the other ones are better for a long-term fit. Any questions about that? Okay. I'm going back to sharing my screen. Okay, so you'll have this with it written out if you want to do it the exact way that I did, or that I would if I was doing it. Okay, so I want to talk next about underarms. So what happens on the sweater that we're going to make is there's going to be a little underarm seam, but you don't do any special shaping or anything for this. This little red mark is where your underarm seam is going to be. And it's created out of part of the body and part of the sleeve. So there's nothing to do to create this. There's no underarm shaping. It's kind of the magic of this kind of yoke sweater. Only thing I want to point out on this drawing before we look at some more drawings of how the underarm seams formed is these are measuring length, these two red lines with the dots, the vertical and horizontal lines. So just want to make sure, obviously the body's pretty easy to measure the length. You measure it straight from your cast on to your needle, and that's the length that you've got. I want to make sure when you're measuring sleeves, you measure them straight. Don't measure the sleeves along the diagonal. We'll come over this again when we talk about the sleeves. But if you measure your sleeves along the diagonal edge where you're shaping them, they won't come out the right length. So we just got straight up and down, straight across for measuring length. So where does that little underarm seam come from if we're not doing any armhole shaping? Okay, so here's the pieces we're going to be knitting. The bottom one in the middle is the body, and then there's 2 sleeves, and then the top's the yoke. So we knit the bottom 3 first. So the obviously they have stitches all around the top edge because they're circular, but we're going to divide the stitches up into sections before we join it together. So you can see the red line represents the front of each piece. So we're going to take not quite half the stitches of one sleeve, plus not quite half the stitches of the center, plus not quite half the stitches of the second sleeve, put them all together on one needle in one big section, and that's going to be the front. We're going to do the same thing on the back. And in between those sections where I have the little green lines, we're going to be putting stitches on hold. And those will become the underarms. And we'll just graft them together at the end of the sweater. You can use Kitchener stitch or 3 needle bind off. There's different options, Russian grafting. I'll show you different options when we get to that. But that's where those stitches come from. When we take the pieces and put them together, we'll be identifying those stitches. And if you look at just this body, because that's what we're working on this week, those green bars will be, I don't know, I'm just making this number up, but 5 stitches before and after each side seam marker. So it's going to be different depending what your size is, but it'll be a few stitches before and after each side seam marker will be set aside to be the underarm seams. Okay, so what happens is on this drawing on the left, you can see I pushed the sleeves closer to the body. So the green lines on the sleeves overlap the green lines on the body. And so they just, the same number of stitches will be set aside on the sleeves, and you push them together. And so again, the red line on the lower part, say we were using 2 circulars. The red line would be the stitches on the one circular for the front, and the dotted blue lines would be the stitches on the second circular for the back. Because if you're using one long circular at this point, you've got a lot of stitches. You need like a pretty long circular, but you would just put a marker there. And then those green stitches would be on holders. And we would just leave them hanging there till later. So knitting that first couple rounds after you join it, it's going to look weird because you've got those underarm seams just hanging there, holding the pieces together. It's going to look really funky, but eventually the yoke shaping, the yoke starts to form a shape, and it just falls together. And then the drawing on the right here is what happens when you knit the yoke. And I just moved it down so you could see how those will line up with the red and blue front and back of it. So it's kind of, I love this shape of sweater because it, whoever invented it, it's not quite as obvious as some of the other sweater designs, how it's going to work. Like if you just did a drop shoulder sweater and you have like rectangles and trapezoids to sew together, to me that's pretty easy to envision. This is like 3D engineering, and it's really cool, but it's sometimes hard to envision when you have all these pieces, and you know, how is this actually going to make a sweater body, and how is it going to have underarm seams, and how's all that work? I didn't do any underarm shaping, yet I have underarm seams, so it's pretty cool. Raglan sweaters work basically the same way, except on the yoke, the decreases are arranged differently, but the basic structure of one is the same thing. All right, so if you're knitting in the round for the body, the only difference will be where you mark the end of your round. So for a pullover, basically the end of the round will be one of your side seams. And the reason for that is if you do color patterning or anything and you don't use a jogless technique, that'll put the jog or the place where your rounds change on one of your side seams in your underarm, so it's not so obvious. I think most of us or all of us are going to be knitting our body plain because we don't want to have a horizontal stripe across our hips. So we don't have any reason to do that other than convention, that the it's usually the left side is the end of the round for knitting a sweater in the round. For the cardigan, we will have the end of the round be in the center front. And that's because at some point we're going to cut it open. And so if we had any jog or anything going on, that's going to be where we cut it open, and that's going to be where we put button bands on, and all of that is going to be hidden. So got to think about button bands if you are making a cardigan, okay? So your button bands will add to the dimension of your sweater, right? So you've got your body. So say we had 200 stitches and we're knitting a pullover, that's all the stitches we have, right? So that's, what if it's 5 stitches an inch, it'd be 40 inches, right? Okay, but if we're adding button bands to that, so we have a 40-inch body plus button bands, that gives us a 41 or 42-inch body, depending what kind of button bands we do. So button bands will make the sweater a little bigger. So you may want to figure your total number to be like 190 or 195 in this example. No one's going to have like that number, but so that your sweater comes out the size you want and not a little bigger. Now, button bands can be all kinds of things. So you can knit on, you've probably seen them where they're ribbing and they're 1 inch to 1.5 inches wide. And then you put buttonholes on one side and you know, buttons on the other side and you button it. But you could also do something really narrow, like an I-cord on each side. Make the I-cord attached and leave it unattached where you wanted each buttonhole. Or you could do the I-cord on both sides and put a zipper in. Or you could just do a, you know, if you crochet, you could just do a row of single crochet or crab stitch and put a zipper in if you don't want to, you know, add to it. So you have to think about that. So those of you who are doing cardigans, again, feel free to ask me any questions about that. The other thing is, if you're going to cut your sweater open, then you probably want to cast on some special stitches for the steek, or the steek. Steek is a Scottish word that really just means stitch, but in English we use that word to mean a section of stitches where we're going to cut our knitting open. So you would probably want to cast on 3 to 5 extra stitches for the steek that don't count in your main number of stitches. So this is all covered in the ethnic knitting exploration book. There's a whole section on cardigans and everything. So for this point, the main thing you have to be concerned about is that you get the number of stitches you want for the size you want. So think about, so you do have to think about, if you're making a cardigan, if you're going to add button bands that are like 1 inch to it. I usually add some that are like 1 inch wide, I guess, or 1.5 inches. Or if you think you're going to do a zipper or something where you just have an I-cord around the edge, that really doesn't add anything, maybe 1/2 inch. So, so think about that. Let me know if you have any questions for casting on for cardigans for that amount. Other than that, if you're knitting your body plain, like I said, you're just going to be knitting this tube. And if you're not doing any shaping, you knit the cardigan and the pullover body just the same. When we get to the point later, if we're going to do shaping, or when we set aside the armholes, that's when it becomes different, where it matters what the end of the round is. But for like the waistband and the first few inches, you're just going around and around and around, nothing matters. Both of cardigan and pullover people will be knitting exactly the same, around and around and around and around. So that's it. So then just back to that, that's just the diagram of what we're doing. So that's all I had in there. Anyone have any questions about any of that? Again, there's a lot more about each of these things in the book, which I'm hoping that you all got to read the chapter on the Icelandic sweater. And then if you're doing a cardigan, the section on cardigans.
Donna,
Yeah.
for the steeks, you said add 3 to 5 stitches. Is that on both sides? So would you add like 3?
No,
on
no,
the
no. You would
side?
just say, yeah. So just 3 to 5 stitches. I would probably add 5 because I'm a little nervous about cutting the steek, and we're going to cut in the center stitch. So if
That's
you only have 3, you only have 1 extra stitch on each side of it. If you put 5, so basically like
I was thinking if I
you
added
have a
10,
marker
then
on
I'd be
each
really
side of the steek, and the steek would be the your end of the round.
okay.
That makes sense?
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am. Thank
And
you.
so I would probably do 5, because then that gives me 2 on each side when I'm cutting to not mess up. And later we'll talk about, we can sew these on the sewing machine, we can sew them by hand, we can crochet them. There's lots of ways to secure them before you cut it. And with the yarn we have, it's not going to want to fall apart anyway, because it's not over processed and it's got tooth to it, so it's going to want to stick together. So you really wouldn't have to like sew it first at all if you didn't want to, because after we cut it, we will, you know, fold it back and then put a button band over it to cover it or something. So you don't, so also, if you're going to steek it and you never did it before, when we get to the finishing class, I'm going to have you, if you saved your swatches, I'm going to have you cut one of your swatches open first, because I don't want anyone cutting their first thing being their sweater. You won't mess it up. It's like really way easier than it seems. But I know, like, after you did all that knitting, it's like, oh my God, I have to cut it. Yeah. Okay, let me show you my favorite cast on for sweaters, and then we can just chat any other questions or chat about whatever, the yarn and our plans. You can each kind of tell me what you're planning to do. So I'll show you my cast on. Whoops. Okay, so does everyone see my hands now? Okay, so this is my setup. I've already cast on some stitches. I am doing a regular long tail cast on. So if you do a long tail cast on, you would hold the yarn and needles however you want. And I'm not showing you how to start a long tail cast on, although I do have a YouTube video that shows the whole process from, you know, the first stitch and everything that I can send you the link to. But I think most of you probably know long tail cast on, but I want to show you what's different than that I do. First, you might notice that I have 2 needles in my knitting. This is a tradition in like Lithuania and Russia. And it makes each stitch, you can see how tall my stitches are because they're over 2 needles. So what happens there is it makes each stitch bigger, because I used to have a really hard time knitting into my cast on. The first row of knitting was really hard for me to do. So knitting into 2 needles or a larger needle, you know, if you don't want to put 2 in, you could just say you're knitting your sweater on size 7, you could cast on a 9. I usually just do 2 because then I don't have to dig out a different needle and then put it away. But anyhow, so that makes your stitches longer. And then I also want my stitches to be able to spread out. See how easily my stitches spread out on my long tail cast on? It'd be super stretchy. Okay, now that's not because it's on a bigger needle. The bigger needle affects this part of the stitch that is the part you knit into. To get them to have more yarn between the stitches so they can stretch out, I hold my knitting like this back off the tips. I'm holding the part that's already done, which could be just your first stitch or your slip knot, but I already have some. I hold that off the tips. Then I do my cast on. So I go into my thumb loop and pull it down from my finger loop. However you do long tail cast on is fine. But I do that at the tips and pull it so it's tight. And then I let go and then pull it back to my knitting. So as I do each stitch, it's not right next to the other one, it's away. And then I loosen my tension and pull it back. And I never even realized I did this until I was having a talk with Kate Atherley about how to make a loose long tail cast on, and about, you know, where each part of the stitch comes from. But you see how that automatically, that adds that little, like in this case, it's like 1/4 of an inch or something. So make your stitch, tug it up so it's tight, then relax your tension and pull it back. And if you do that, your stitches will make a loose, stretchy edge, which is great for, well, anything you want stretchy. This is my main cast on. So other than that, there's nothing that I'm doing special about the long tail cast on, except you know, keeping that distance. So I'm casting on at the tip, but I'm holding my other stitches back away from the tip, and that just makes it stretchier. So if you want to try that, you might like it. But the main thing for the sweater, if you have a different cast on that you like, you want something that's a stretchy cast on, I think, at the bottom of a sweater, because you got to put it on over your head and, you know, get as, if it, especially if it's a pullover, you got to, you know, put your arms in it and get it on you. So you don't want something that's going to be not a stretchy edge. Yeah. So while we're talking about that, I want to talk about needle sizes, because I would probably end up knitting my sweater with 3 different needle sizes, because we have ribbing, plain knitting, and color work. So this is not a sweater, but this is a cowl, and it's made as the same as a yoke on a yoke sweater. So this is my ribbing, and I used a size 4 needle, I think. Yeah, it was a size 4 needle because it's the one I broke, if you follow me on Instagram. I used a size 4 needle on this. This is 1x1 twisted rib. And after 6 rows, I moved it over 1 stitch to make it look more interesting. I mean, that's something you could do on your sweater too, if you just don't want plain ribbing. This is knit 1 through the back loop, purl 1. And then, like I said, after 6 rows, I got bored. So I started doing purl 1, knit 1 through the back loop, just because it gives it a little extra texture. But anyway, I used a size 4 needle here. I used a size 5 needle here, which is basically plain stockinette stitch. I did some little purl bumps with the alternating color because I get bored with stockinette stitch, like I told you. This is what I was talking about last class. Sometimes I do this without the extra color. So I would just do a bunch of knits and then purl, knit 5, purl 1, knit 5, purl 1. And then, you know, 4 or 6 rows later, do it offset so that they alternate and make a little pattern. Just because stockinette stitch bores me. So I do that to, you know, entertain myself. In this case, I added the color, but so I used a size 5 needle for that. And then I went to a size 6 needle for this, because for stranded color work, my knitting is always a little bit tighter than for single color knitting. And I wanted the color work part and this part to be the same gauge. So you may end up using multiple needle sizes for your project. And I went back to the 4s, size 4s, and did the same twisted ribbing for the neck. So for your sweater, you will probably be using your small needles for the smallest size for the ribbing. I do twisted ribbing a lot because my ribbing's always really loose. If I did regular, see? If I did regular ribbing, I would go down even another size. For some reason, my ribbing's always loose, probably because my pearls are really loose. So this is the little cowl that's basically the yoke of a yoke sweater without the sweater part. Did someone have a question? No? Okay. So your gauge swatches. I'm guessing that you did stockinette stitch and color work. Yay, I see Tracy holding up a gauge swatch. Yeah. So was anyone else holding up gauge swatches? Anyway, yeah, there you go, Lee. Tracy again.
This is
Yeah.
my
Mine
second.
apart.
Oh, everybody's got
Yeah.
gauge swatches. Cool. So that'll give you something to check. If you did both of you, if you did a colorwork swatch and a plain stockinette swatch on the same needles, you can see if your gauge is different
Mhm.
for those or the same. A lot of people get different gauge, and sometimes like the stitch gauge changes but the row gauge doesn't. Stockinette stitch with color work, for a lot of people the stitches tend to be more square than the regular plain stockinette stitches tend to be a little bit rectangular. So anyway, you can measure those both on your swatches. So again, talking about needle sizes, you'll do your ribbing on and the small needle. Usually, traditionally, people do it 2 sizes smaller than the main needle size on a sweater, but you are all experienced knitters, so I suspect that you know your own knitting tension. So I know, like, when I do the sweater, I'm going to go down 3 sizes for the ribbing because my ribbing always comes out super loose compared to my stockinette stitch. So use your intuition and your experience as you make these decisions. So, and then the body is mostly plain. I just want to mention something that I learned in a class a long time ago when I took my first sweater class, is that measure your knitting as you go and check your gauge as you go. Don't just say, okay, I got this gauge on the swatch, now I'm just going to cast on and knit. Keep measuring your piece as you go and your gauge as you go, because sometimes it can change as you relax into a project, or it will be different whether you're drinking wine or coffee or different things like that. I think the body of this sweater is fairly safe to knit with wine because it's just plain, as long as you're not going to spill it, but you're not going to have anything major to mess up on the body. So I think wine knitting's okay for the body of this sweater. But it can change your tension. So always keep measuring it as you go, because if you start to get really loose or really tight, you can go up or down in needle size if you can't breathe and magically change your gauge back to what it was. Some people can do that, but most of us, I think, if we change, something changes in our environment or whatever, and our gauge really changes. I've only had that happen to me a couple times, but I had to switch to a different needle size than I started with halfway through a project because my gauge just totally changed and I couldn't figure out why or what had happened. And to keep it, the same size, I switched needles. It was really weird, but from what I understand, that happens to people more often than we'd like to think. Gauge is like this annoying thing that, like you said, just because you made a swatch doesn't mean that everything will come out perfect as you go. I want to say one more thing, and I know we have like a lot of stitches when we start our body, and I thought about starting the class with the sleeves, but then you get right into different kind of things and shaping the sleeves and how long do you want them to be and stuff like that. So I decided not to do that. Color work, patterning on the sleeves. So I know we have a lot of stitches to cast on, but don't worry if you have to start over a couple times. I have to start over most of my projects a couple times. So I guess my message for this is, if you're like me and you really hate doing the cast on over, if you cast on and do like your first row or two, round or two, you could put a lifeline in Normally I wouldn't do it for something like that, but if you if you got 300 stitches and you don't want to cast on all over again, you could put a lifeline in, and then you can always just rip back down to the lifeline and have those stitches to put back on your needle, and you don't have to start your whole thing over again with the cast on. Yeah. So what I was showing you for the long tail cast on, because we're making the stitches taller and further apart, we're going to need a little bit longer tail. So I always go like this from here. I can pull out my hand. I say 30, 60, 90, 100. That's how I do it. And then one for good measure. I would much rather have a yard or more of yarn left at the end of my long tail cast on than run out after casting on a bunch of stitches. So that might be a reason that some of you don't like to use a long tail cast on, which is fine. I think the knitted cast on would be nice for a sweater because that can also be nice and stretchy. And it doesn't require a long tail. But the other thing you can do is you can take 2 balls of yarn and use one for your thumb and one for your finger for the long tail cast on. And then cut the one that you don't need off anymore when you finish. So you don't really have to pull out a long tail. Your long tail can come from a second ball of yarn or from the inside or outside of your ball of yarn. So that's a trick that I use occasionally when I have a lot of stitches to cast on and I don't feel like accidentally not getting enough yarn on my tail. Yeah, because that's like one of the most annoying things in knitting to me is running out of yarn for a long tail cast on when you have, a couple hundred stitches or more to cast on. But so I think knitted cast on would be good. I think cable cast on is too rigid. It doesn't really have stretch, so I don't really suggest that for a sweater, although it could be okay for a cardigan because you're not going to be pulling it over your head, so you don't need as much give on the bottom edge. And I never recommend the cast on when you just make a loop on your thumb and put that on the needle for something with a lot of stitches, because I found that as you start knitting into that cast on, the thread between the loops gets bigger and bigger, and it's hard to get it really even. So I never use that cast on for something where I need a lot of stitches. I just find that it's not stable enough over the long term to get a consistency on a lot of stitches. I use it a lot for things like buttonholes or just small projects, but I don't think I've ever used it for more than like 10 or 15 stitches. I don't get enough stability or out of it or consistency. So let's see. So who wants to tell me like what you're thinking? Like if you're making a pullover or a cardigan, and if you're all set on your size and your gauge, and if you're making the body plain, et cetera, et cetera. Heather Morano has her hand raised. Go first, Heather.
I am just making a regular pullover. I've already started on
Peter, you're way
body.
ahead.
Because I did a large swatch, because I wanted to do it fully in the round instead of pulling, the cheater way, because that just gets annoying. So the swatch ended up being like this because I tried a bunch of different needle sizes to make sure which one was really going to work.
Yeah.
And then did the color work as well that way. And so it's just going to be the basic body, no shaping in the waist or anything like that. I think I am going to put a color work cuff on the sleeves though.
Okay.
I might do the chicken feet.
Can you hold up your body again?
Yeah.
Your sweater body? So I see the colors moving on there. So I have a question for you. Are you working from just one ball of yarn?
Yes.
Okay. So this is something that I do a lot. I actually like working from one ball of yarn at a time on hand painted yarns because I like to see what patterning and pooling and different things the yarn does. But it can change. So the pooling or striping or whatever it is will be different on the sleeves, the body, and the yoke. So if you don't like pooling, or stripiness, or you want to make your colors more blended, a tip is to work from 2 balls at the same time and knit
Switch per row.
yeah, switch them out every couple rounds. You can, 2 rounds. Usually it's 2 rounds, because if you're working back and forth, it would, it needs to be an even number of rows to be back at the same place to switch yarns. But
Right.
if you're working in the round, you could go A, B, A, B, A, B every round if you want. But by doing that, you're breaking up any color pooling or striping that you'd get. So that's something that you can think about. That will change when you switch from ribbing to stockinette stitch. It'll change. If you do waist shaping, it will change. Anytime you change the gauge, the pattern stitch, or the number of stitches, the way the colors move in the yarn is going to change. So to disguise
I
that,
think I'm gonna, yeah, I think I'm gonna do that for the sleeves, because I know there's really no pooling in this. Like it's
right,
literally just striped. But in my swatch, which was, kind of more like a sleeve size, there
right,
was
yeah,
pooling, which I don't mind at all. But I am gonna do the 2 different yarn balls, because then they'll match the body a little bit more.
yeah, it'll break up the colors more. So that's just something to think about. I usually let it do what it wants because I have fun with that. But
Yeah,
I
me
know a
too.
lot of people like more consistency in, in a project with the way the colors interact. So that's something that you would want to decide now. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else want to share? Denise, I see your hand.
Yes.
Then Tracy.
I'm going to do I did a swatch, and I used the big feet, the big chicken feet.
Mhm.
I did it 3 times because I wanted to do it in color work. So I went around 3 times and did the whole pattern, and I came up with size 7 needles, met the gauge perfectly. So,
Super.
and I'm going to do the cardigan. I'm going to do the plain sleeve. I'm not going to do the pattern in the sleeve. And I figure I'm doing a cast on tomorrow when we have this horrible weather. And if I lose light, that's okay, because I'll just sit outside on the back porch and knit, so.
Oh my gosh, that's right. That hurricane's going right by you.
Right. So,
Yeah.
but that's what I'm going to do. And I mean, this yarn on this swatch is just beautiful. It's absolutely,
Super,
it's a
super.
pleasure to work with, and it really has such a nice feel to it. So I'm very excited about starting this, so
Well,
it's great.
this was a super adventure because we sent this yarn off to do you guys know Stonehenge Knitting Mill?
Mhm.
They make
Yeah.
the crazy yarn and yeah, here down there. They make shepherd's worsted.
Yeah.
Yeah, shepherd's wool, Stonehenge, not Stonehenge, Stonehenge.
Right.
Fiber mill. Anyway, they spun this yarn for us. So, and we sent it to them right before the pandemic, and then they had to shut down, and then we sent them 3 other 3 other yarns, and then they weren't sure which one was which from which sheet, and it was like a huge adventure getting this yarn done. But it's so beautiful. I'm so happy with the way it came out. Yeah.
Yeah,
So.
it's beautiful. It really is. Very happy with it. That's for sure.
Great. Excellent. Tracy, you had wanted to go next? You're muted. So.
No, I was just rearranging myself. It looked like I was
Oh,
raising my
okay.
I'm on my bed and I was just falling over by accident.
Okay. Did you decided what you want to do though?
Well, I have my gauge and my I filled out the chart, so I have the number to cast on and whatnot. I'm doing a
Great.
cardigan, and that's as far as that's all I know.
Okay,
I was
great.
thinking maybe when I get, because I'm doing the neutral colorway, with
Right. I am too.
and I was thinking maybe when I get to the yoke, I might want to throw in like another color just here.
You could
there.
certainly do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you wanted, if you have something from stash, that's fine. But like I said last time, I have a whole box of this yarn left in all the colors, so I could dye something for you. Like if you wanted a skein or 2 in blue or red or whatever,
Oh,
I could do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was really looking at the orange colorway. It was so beautiful, but I don't really wear that color very well. So
Yeah. So you
figured-
don't want a whole sweater of orange and yeah.
I mean, I would love to stare at it, but I don't think I would want to wear it. But
Yeah, I get it.
I need to live next to somebody who knits that color so I can stare at them.
Yeah, just buy a skein and hang it up.
Thank you.
All right, anyone else?
No. I don't know whether you can hear me.
Is this Gail?
This is Gail. Yeah.
Okay, you have no video, but I can hear you. So go ahead.
I don't know how to put the video on.
It's
I just
not a
gotta look.
problem if you just want to talk and not be on video,
Okay.
that's cool.
Well, I'm gonna do a cardigan and everything. And I think I'm understanding everything. We just cast on an extra 5 stitches when we're doing the cast on.
Right.
And then we otherwise we're going to keep doing what the instructions say. I don't understand that last little part that says next round after you get to the 17 inches, you know, the
Oh,
15
when
and a
you're
half.
going to set aside the underarm seams?
Oh, is that what that is? Okay.
Yes. So you'll be setting aside stitches for your underarm seams. So we can go over that at the very beginning of our next class
Okay.
in more detail. And I'll have, unless something goes wrong, I will have my body done up to there to demo it for you on my actual sweater that I'm knitting.
Okay, good. It'd probably be better to see it than to try to
Yeah,
understand
that's that
directions.
confusing part of this kind of design. That's the confusing part of it is what happened. How does that work?
So for the cardigan, I'm going to cast on all the stitches, and the end is going to be the middle seam where the buttons are going to go, right? The middle of my
Right,
front.
that'll be the end of your round. Will be right in the front and that's where your extra stitches will be. But like I said, if you're just knitting your body plain in the round and all that with no shaping, you don't have to, add those extra stitches for cutting later, but you don't have
Yeah.
to think about it much beyond that until later.
I was looking at something and it had the extra stitches in like different colors or anything. I don't know, would that help to show you where the steek
No,
goes?
you don't want to use a different yarn for it.
Okay,
If you're doing in color work, when we get to the yoke, you'll do something like that because you want to keep knitting with your colors all the way across those extra stitches, but you won't want to be knitting, a chicken. You'll
Yeah.
just knit like a checker pattern or something.
Mhm.
But
Right.
when it's all one color, nothing.
Nothing, just extra stitches.
Yep.
Okay. And then we still join it. It makes it easier. If we join it in the round and knit in the round.
Well, for the body, it doesn't matter. If you would like to knit your body back and forth without the extra 5 stitches, you can. You can still knit the yoke in the round when we get up to there if for the color work part. And I'll tell you how to do that when you get that. So anyone who's making their body plain and doing a cardigan, if you want to knit it back and forth on the body, we can still knit the yoke in the round. And since you don't have color work on the body, you don't have to worry about that. And I can show you what to do for that, in a few weeks when we get to the yoke. So,
But if we're going back and forth, we'd have to knit 1 row and purl 1 row.
right. So you still have a lot of purling, and then your gauge, you have to re-gauge swatch because you gauge in the round and back and forth is not always the same. So I think in the
Okay.
round is generally easier for this project.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's what I suggest, unless you have some particular reason you really don't want to do it, and then fine.
No.
just- Yeah,
I think I've cut something apart before.
okay,
It is kind of scary, but
yeah. It's scary, but it's really hard to mess up because you're going to be nervous and very careful. I think if you're
Yes.
doing it a bunch of times and you're not nervous anymore, that's when you might mess up because you're just going too fast. So, okay, thanks. Anyone
what
else?
if you
Oh,
what if you made
question?
what if you made your very last stitch a purl, on the front to show that that's because when you're
Were
getting
you
ready
gonna
to
cut?
cut. Yeah.
You can do that. Yes, you can make it that you can make a purl stitch where you're going to cut. And that way, when we go to cut it, that makes it very easy to see.
That's what I was thinking. It might be easier. Okay.
Certainly.
Thank-
Yeah. Good tip.
Okay.
Anyone else want to share ideas of what you're working on?
Hi, this is Donna from Georgia.
Hello. Oh,
Hello,
I see your hand raised there. Yeah.
Yeah, I tried. So I'm doing the cardigan. I'm trying your new cast on method here.
Nice.
So the one question I had when you talked about that rib, would the rib be longer than what's in the pattern? I think it says what, for 2.5 inches. So would you do a longer rib for the way you shifted it one stitch over?
No, I would do what I did on this piece is I did 1 inch or 1.25 inches and then the other 1.25 inches. I wouldn't make like 5 inches of ribbing or anything like that. I don't think.
Okay.
Mm-mm.
Okay, that's the only question I had.
Yeah,
One other
okay.
question I do have is how do you keep the yarn from tangling up on itself? You know how it gets.
From the cast on?
Yeah, I'm getting the little curly cues already starting in my yarn.
Yeah, you don't. What happens with the long tail cast on, and depending on how you knit, just let it go every now and then and let it undo its thing. Just let go of it. Is it the tail that's doing it or the part on the ball?
It's the part on the ball. I'm
then you-
doing 2 balls for the cast on, so I don't have to worry about how
Oh,
long.
yeah.
And it's
So what
the
happens?
one on the
what
thumb
happens-
is. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No. What happens with yarn is obviously it's strands twisted together, right? And when you are doing cast on or making knit stitches and purl stitches and doing things with it, depending on how you tension the yarn, how you hold the yarn, how you move the yarn, you are going to either add twist to the yarn or take twist away from the yarn. And I tend to take twist away from the yarn. So I'm not going to put on my other camera again, but I don't know if you can see here a little bit, might be too bright, but you can see the top one is where is like one of my strands of the long tail cast on, and see how it's become like untwisted a lot. That just happens to me. So I usually don't worry about it at all. If it's really bothering me, I'll like pick up my knitting, hold the ball of yarn and let it untwist, let the knitting hang from the ball of yarn and untwist or something, but it's not gonna really hurt anything.
It's just more
But,
frustrating because I have another
yeah,
cardigan
yeah.
doing,
So
and I
it's
had
just-
to let it hang forever.
Yeah, and if that makes you hate this cast on and you have another one you like, that's not gonna be too stiff, go for it.
Well,
Um,
I think I get it when I'm just knitting. I have the same problem. I had some
Oh.
twin yarn that I just finished the front pieces and I was having to
Show me how you
literally.
show me how you tension your yarn and how you hold it, yarn and needles.
For this one, I'm just holding it that way. I'm a thrower. I'm not a.
Oh, okay.
So I normally just, I don't know if this one's, like here's a sock and I just hold my yarn like this. And I just go like that.
So you don't even really do anything with it.
No, it just twists on
Yeah.
me crazy.
That's just because the yarn's twisted and maybe you're adding twist to it the way you do it. I take twist out of it the way I do it. And the only thing you can do is just hold up by the ball of yarn and let it untwist.
I didn't know if I was wondering if I wound it differently, would that make a difference? Because I normally,
No.
I go clockwise with my handle, but if I went counterclockwise and it spun the opposite way, would that do something different?
You mean to the ball?
Yeah, when you're putting, when
No, I
you're
don't
loading
know. It's the way the yarn is spun.
it. Okay,
Yarn is spun one way, and then when they put the plies together, it's twisted the other way. And almost all yarn is done in the same direction. Occasionally, there's some yarns, like in Sweden, they spin it in the opposite direction because that Swedish twined knitting needs the yarn to have a different kind of twist in it. But that's part of the physics of the way yarn is spun, and there's really nothing that can be done about it that I've ever discovered.
okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Okay, that's fine. If you would like to share something with me in email or on my Ravelry, forums, if you don't want to share now, that's great. And if you don't have any questions or anything, knit on, and we will regroup in 2 weeks and talk about how to get the body set aside and start the sleeves.
Okay.
All right?
All right.
Have fun, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thank you.